Well, good evening and a very warm welcome to this evening's presentation on behalf of Milim. Welcome to you wherever you may be. This evening, our series of online talks and conversations continues with our guest, Professor Saskia Koenen-Snijder, and I'll introduce Saskia in just a moment after some brief housekeeping. Please do ask questions. This is possible by typing whatever you'd like to ask into the Q&A facility on your screen. As ever, we'll do our best to get through as many of your questions as we can. You'll also find a chat facility on your screen, and this will allow you to send a message to all of the other participants on this webinar, should you wish to do so. We are recording this event, and you will find it on our website at milim.org.uk in the next couple of days. There you will also find recordings of other past events, as well as details of our future programme for which you can book tickets. And so to our guest today, born in the Netherlands and educated at the University of Utrecht, and with a PhD from the University of Michigan, Saskia Koenen-Snijder is currently Professor of Modern Jewish History at the University of South Carolina. She teaches Jewish history and civilizations courses, as well as seminars on the Holocaust, the history of Anne Frank, and Jewish history of the American South. She's author of Building a Public Judaism, Synagogues and Jewish Identity in 19th Century Europe, which was a finalist in the Grawemeyer Award of Religion. Saskia's second book, this one, A Brilliant Commodity, Diamonds and Jews in a Modern Setting, was published last year and is the subject of her talk. Today, she joins us from Columbia in South Carolina. Saskia, a very warm Milim welcome to you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I'm happy to be here, and hello to everybody.
Over to you.
Floor's mine. Thank you, Jonathan, for this introduction, for having invited me to come and talk about my new book, which I'm happy to share with everyone tonight. So I thought I'd start a PowerPoint presentation because there are so many wonderful images about the story of diamonds in 19th and 20th century transatlantic trade. And so let me share my screen with you, and then we'll take a look at what we're going to be talking about tonight. So I'd like to talk to you about this new book that came out with Oxford last year, A Brilliant Commodity, Diamonds and Jews in a Modern Setting. And it explores really the Jewish connections to the 19th and 20th century transatlantic diamond trade. Jewish adventurers and merchants, buyers and sellers and entrepreneurs were really part and parcel of the earliest development of the transatlantic diamond industry and its growth into a global enterprise. And on 3 continents, let's see if this works here. There we go. 3 continents, Europe, Africa, and North America, Jews really do become key players, mostly through close commercial networks and family connections, creating a very successful commodity chain between Cape Town, London, Amsterdam, and New York. Examining the routes that diamonds traveled and studying the people who mined and processed and sold them places them at the heart of the industry. And so this evening we'll follow its journey, really. So I thought we'd start in South Africa and then take it to London and Amsterdam, and then we'll finally chat a little bit about New York City. So we're going to follow the trajectory, really, of the stone over the Atlantic Ocean. And we'll discover that Jews are important to the gem trade, but also that diamonds are important to Jewish life and to Jewish modernization in the 19th and early 20th century. And so a number of central questions really emerged as I started mining for materials and writing this book. And they concern the role and significance of various Jewish communities directly involved in and affected by the diamond. One of the first questions that popped up is, why is it Jews who play such a pivotal role in developing a global commodity chain in gems? Not merely these gentlemen here, some of whom may look familiar to you, who became incredibly successful, but also the tens of thousands of other Jewish men and women who worked in cutting and polishing factories or in retail. In Amsterdam, for example, home to some 50,000 Jews by the late 1800s, 50% of the entire community depended economically on the stone. This is immense. Half of the entire Jewish community was involved in somehow in diamond manufacturing, in sale, in trading. Another question that becomes important that intrigued me is, why is it diamonds as opposed to any other object of conspicuous consumption that attracted a disproportionate Jewish presence? And why did this industry matter to Jews and to how historians write about the modern Jewish experience? And so to find answers to these questions, I analyzed the trajectory of rough diamond extraction from cave mines to distribution offices in London to factories in Amsterdam, and where precious stones were cut and polished by overwhelmingly proletarian Jews, and finally to New York City, where sparkling gems become adornments to bourgeois consumers. This approach makes diamonds great storytellers, and that's kind of my big theme in the book, that we can look at this object as a storyteller that reveals the myriad ways in which the stone affected Jewish socioeconomic mobility, their politicization, particularly in the case of Amsterdam, and their acculturation to Gentile societies. So let us first turn to South Africa, the first leg, if you want to call it that, and what would become a transatlantic commodity chain, and in particular the Cape Colony, which was part of the British Empire at the time. In 1866, the teenage son of a Boer farmer picked up an unusually shiny pebble on his father's farm, located near a frontier village called Hopetown, about 700 miles northeast of Cape Town. His neighbor already had a hunch that this was not a typical pebble, or that there was more than just a stone, but what precisely it was he didn't know. And the stone changed hands numerous times until months later it arrived by mail in a plain envelope on the desk of Dr. William Atherstone, a geologist in Grahamstown, who identified it as a diamond. Captivated by this unusual find, the governor of the Cape Colony bought it, sent the stone to the Paris exhibition of 1867, where visitors could see with their own eyes that South Africa produced riches beyond sheep and grapes, which were the two primary agricultural staples at the time. A few years later, in 1869, the same local farmer stepped into a country store in Hopetown, carrying a superb 83.5-carat diamond. He had gotten it from a young African shepherd who had found it and sold it to him for 500 sheep, 10 oxen, and a horse. It's an important moment, and we have to understand that before this time, no diamonds are found on the African continent. Diamonds before this time come from India, and they come from South America, Brazil mostly. But Africa was not on anyone's radar. And so the fact that they are finding stones on the continent is a revelation. And they're finding them in places that were unusual, what they call dry locations. Normally, stones were found near a water source, so people would be standing knee deep in rivers and riverbeds and breaking labor, really. So Africa was unusual in that regard. This time there was zero doubt, though. They took it to the country store owned by German Jewish cousins Gustav and Martin Lilienfeld. Not only because the person knew that they were merchants, but also because he wanted to have it appraised. The Lilienfelds had familial and commercial connections to the Mosenthal family in Port Elizabeth, who ran an import and export firm. Here you can see this early establishment in Hopetown. And they invited a Dutch Jewish lapidary who had emigrated to South Africa a few years before to assess the gem. And it proved to be one of the largest diamonds ever found. So with the financial help of and guarantee of the Mosenthal Company, the Lilienfelds purchased what became known as the Star of Africa. By the time of the Earl of Dudley purchased the Star of Africa for £25,000, diamond fever hit, and the diamond rush to the Northern Cape had begun. Here you can see the cover of Harper's Weekly a few years later, 1872, with a crowd of fortune hunters hastily establishing mining camps in the area. Many came from nearby small towns and farms, and they were soon joined by Black Africans, by hopefuls from British colonies, and by newly arrived immigrants. By 1870, some 5,000 diggers had set up tents and were sifting soil. And these were men from all kinds of professions. They were butchers and bakers, doctors, carpenters, clerks, laborers. And contemporaries really write a lot about, they spoke of Babel as they heard so many different languages on the newly emerging diamond fields. And you can see it in the newspaper that they're beginning to refer to the diamond fields with capital letters. That becomes a place, it becomes a concept that is soon accepted. And in their feverish attempt to find minerals, diggers applied techniques similar to those that were practiced in Brazil and India, that is standing knee-deep in the soft gravel, washing and sifting debris. But much of the bewilderment of the first diggers, they also begin to see stones cropping up in unexpected dry locations without any clear pattern. So this causes a lot of confusion about what does this mean, and it challenged long-held alluvial theories on diamond extraction. Prospectors found stones on a farm called Vooruitzicht in Afrikaans, Foresight, some 20 miles from the Vaal River, which belonged to the brothers Johannes and Diederik de Beers. This is where the name of the De Beers Mining Company comes from. It wasn't purchased by the De Beers. It was the geographical location, the farm of the De Beers brothers. And two adjacent farms yielded stones as well. And within a few months, thousands of diggers and prospectors descended on these properties with their horses and oxen, wagons, tents, and tools, and sometimes their families. By 1872, the so-called dry diggings had produced permanent settlements, including New Rush, and you can see this on this map, the different kind of places where they begin to find large amounts of rough stones. And New Rush becomes the future town of Kimberley, as well as Du Toit-Span, De Beers, Bultfontein, all located within a 4-mile radius. The Northern Cape proved a glittering Golconda when diggers discovered underground funnel-shaped diamond pipes. And diamond pipes really looked like a carrot. They kind of shaped like a carrot. And initially people had no idea what was underneath their feet. They're finding them in the topsoil or once they start digging, but they have no idea of the immense diamond mines underneath, the pipes underneath. 4 of these sites would collectively supply millions of carats to global consumers over the course of the next century. De Beers, Kimberley, Du Toit-Span, and Bultfontein. And really within this, circumference, is that the English word, the radius of 4 miles, that produced the millions and millions and millions of carats over the next century and longer, and supplying the world with rough stones. The brothers De Beers, who owned this farm, sold it long before anyone and really realized the extent of the riches beneath the surface. They were utterly overwhelmed by an army of diggers who came equipped with shovels and pickaxes, and they accepted the offer of £6,000 made by merchant speculators and fled the scene. They did not know. They thought they made a good deal and they left. They thought, take the money and run. But the name stuck, and so the name of the De Beers became famous later on. Already in 1869, Leopold Lilienfeld, who had examined the Star of Africa in his country store only months before, purchased the Bultfontein farm for £2,000. Again, with the financial support from the Mosenthal firm, he founded the first company on the diamond fields, the Hopetown Company. And so you can see that Jews are on the scene there already before diamonds are found in import and export business, mostly on the coast. And they are part of the scene when they are finding diamonds in this area and are joining many of them. But because they are already proficient in retail, because they have connections, because they have import and export firms, imperial channels that are already operating, they basically incorporate this new object, or this new a gemstone, into already existing trade networks. The number of Jews among those digging, sifting, and sorting remained really modest. In South Africa, as in elsewhere, Jews were a minority population surrounded mostly by non-Jews. And although the exact demographic data for the early settlements in the Northern Cape are unknown, the 1875 census counted about 540 Jews in the entire Cape Colony, a quarter of 1% of its white population. Moreover, consistent with their professional experiences and economic profiles, Jews, established South African Jews as well as recent immigrants, concentrated on commercial enterprises, providing growing populations with goods and services. A small number of Jews worked with pickaxes, buckets, and shovels, but a greater number engaged in getting those tools to the diamond fields in the first place. So some Jews are digging, but most of them are what you see in this picture down here, or referred to as a smouse. A smouse is referred to a Jewish trader who literally went with horse and carriage, and sometimes just with what they were carrying on their backs, from mine to mine, seeing what people needed. They needed Barney Barnato, who became immensely successful, arrived on the diamond fields. He walked from Cape Town to Kimberley, 750 miles next to an ox cart. And he started out selling pencils because people needed pencils and other goods, all kinds of different merchandise that's needed when you begin a new settlement. And so it's mostly that Jews are engaged in providing the goods that were required. And once they realize that they can also do the same with diamonds, which is initially used as currency, because there's not a lot of money in circulation, and so they're using little rough stones as currency, then they can also begin to incorporate that into their inventories and ultimately start dealing in that exclusively. In the late 1860s and early 70s, Jewish involvement thus centered primarily on the trade of general merchandise and commercial services in areas of settlement in the Northern Cape. So the sudden concentration of human activity in an area of 4 square miles, isolated from the remote coastal centers of commerce, created a high demand for produce and basic goods. Diggers and prospectors relied on long-distance exchange, complicated by slow communication and wagon-based transportation, having only limited access to financial credit. The expanding networks of produce and labor supplies for the diamond fields were not yet integrated into regional economies. So it's precisely this economic niche that attracted Jewish entrepreneurs who recognized the growing need for commodities and who offered access to long-distance networks and provisions. And so the Lilienfelds, the Mosenthal families who were on the coast proved to be particularly helpful in this regard. Here you can also see the slide on the top, or this little advertisement, is a good indication of this. You see there'll be a Thursday market, and the undersigned, which is out of Mosenthal, will immediately after the wool sale also auction 15 diamonds. And so we see that they're integrating diamonds into other commodities. Already well-established South African Jewish commercial firms, such as the Mosenthal brothers, the Lilienfeld brothers of Cape Town and Port Elizabeth, sent storekeepers to the vicinity to meet the new demand in supplies, and thereby contributing to the expansion of an economic infrastructure that connected the South African interior to coastal towns. Let's see. There's a great picture here on the top right of a diamond digger in the early days of Kimberley. Adolf and Joseph Mosenthal, who had left Germany in the 1840s, had established trading posts that provided Boer farmers with essentials imported from Europe. And that included ready-made clothing, boots, clay pipes, brandy, tea kettles, furniture, even pickles and mustard. Their younger brother, Julius Mosenthal, a Londoner, ran the English side of the South African venture. He selected and ordered English goods, arranged the details of shipping, and sent large consignments of cargo on steamers to Cape Town and Port Elizabeth. By 1860, Mosenthal brothers had opened 5 country stores throughout the Cape region, in addition to those on the coast, and becoming a leading merino wool merchant in the colony. The family had entrepreneurial fathers and brothers and uncles in London and continental Europe, where they established offices, expanding their trading network. And that is kind of an example that we see many times over, is that people had an uncle somewhere, they had a nephew or brother that was in London or in Amsterdam or elsewhere. And so they had people they could trust, they had people that they had connections with, or a social circle that mattered, that because communication was slow and because it was part of the world that was not particularly well developed yet in terms of infrastructure, you needed those connections and family and trustworthy relatives that facilitated international commerce, and that's a key point. Newly arrived immigrants too engaged in commercial activities. Isaac Lewis, his cousin Sammy Marks, born in Lithuania, arrived via London in South Africa in the late 1860s, making their way to the diamond fields with wagons full of provisions. Starting out as peddlers, they soon became involved in diamond dealing, especially as diggers' working claims often bartered diamonds for daily necessities because they didn't really have a lot of access to currency. Rough stones served as currency, and it soon became apparent that dealing in diamonds alone was sufficiently lucrative to climb the economic ladder. As intermediaries, these peddlers created the very first link in transatlantic commodity chains in diamonds. Numerous Jewish men who made an important name for themselves later on started out this way. And Barney Barnato, born in London's East End as Barnett Isaacs, the future board director of the De Beers Company, was born dirt poor in London, sold pencils first, and climbed and worked himself up, and went back to London, where he then opened offices, but starting out on the diamond fields, knowing how things worked, having kind of a good sense of the infrastructure, and then taking all that experience back to London and making the connections that he needed. So, in other words, Cape diamonds were absorbed into already existing circulations of imported and exported goods. In the last decades of the 19th century, we see that Jews moved from the periphery into the center of the international diamond industry. They benefited from the growth in supply and demand, working within these imperial infrastructure that espoused and facilitated economic developments deemed so deeply problematic by modern day progressives, such as company consolidation and monopolization. And so this map actually shows you this, that people at first worked small plots, those were individual diggers, and they created these new diamond laws, and you were only allowed to have 3 plots and not more. Later on, as we see, as the mining really progresses and becomes much more professional and deeper, with all kinds of machinery, then we also see the beginning of consolidation of these mines, and company consolidation, where they begin to purchase and buy up more and more of these, moving basically from thousands and thousands of owners of plots to progressively moving to fewer and fewer larger companies. So when it came to diamonds, many Jews became successful entrepreneurs, operating in parallel fashion to non-Jewish merchants engaged in different commodities and industries. And so in this regard, I would argue Jewish diamond merchants and investors were decidedly modern. They participated in the imperial project with the same degree of eagerness and possibility as their non-Jewish peers. What is really important here is the timing. The timing seemed perfect at this time, seemingly unlimited supplies, meeting higher demand, new technology, and access to investment capital, and all of those, and print media to advertise all these new diamonds being found. And so that combination in the late 19th century was a recipe for success. And you can see that's here. When we look at the numbers alone, you can see 1867 and 1868, when they first find diamonds, we're talking about a few hundred, few thousand carats that are being exported to Europe. And if you take a look at 30 years later, 1892, over 3 million carats are mined and sent across the South African heartland to Cape Town or Elizabethtown on a steamship to London. And so in total, over the 19th century, 50 million carats is mined and exported. It became a full third of the total Cape exports at the time. Okay, so that in a nutshell was South Africa. Let's move to London. And following the diamond from South Africa to Europe takes us to London, the global trading hub for rough stones. This is an important point to remember, is that the Indian and Brazilian trades of the 18th century and the early 19th century had already created the foundations of London's market in rough stones. But the ascendancy of Britain's Cape Colony cemented London as the distribution center of the industry. Diamond dealers clustered in Hatton Garden, to this day the city's best-known jewelry district. Those Jewish merchants who had been successful in South Africa established new firms in London to facilitate the international trade in gemstones. Barney Bonato, as I already mentioned, established a London office in 1880, following in the footsteps of other Jewish merchants who shared practical knowledge of the gem trade. Most directors of the main diamond importing companies in London had hands-on experience on the diamond fields. With the financial support of Jewish investors, they became major players in the consolidation of claims and companies. By the early 1890s, largely as the result of company amalgamation and centralization, the De Beers Consolidated Diamond Mine Company controlled over 90% of South Africa's production, turning out 3 million carats a year. The De Beers sold its entire yield to the newly established Diamond Syndicate in London, made up of 10 Jewish firms whose company directors had first made careers on the South African diamond fields and were now leading merchants. And you can see this here on this little chart here. The Bonato brothers, Dunkelsbühler, Mosenthal, Cohen, Liebenfeld, they were all Jewish families became major dealers. All these firms were linked by marriage and owned sister branches in the Cape Colony. Members of the Diamond Syndicate held monthly viewings for their continental clients who traveled to London to purchase rough stones. Having gained the exclusive right to sell South African rough, the syndicate had the authority, in collaboration with De Beers, to regulate the production, sale, and value of diamonds. And so we see here that Jews move from the periphery on the diamond fields and having experience in the trade to becoming central players and central architects of this emerging commodity chain in stones. And these are, you can kind of see it represented here too in these advertisements, the Streeter advertisements, gems and pearls from the ends of the earth. And so you can see here literally that they're offering these two angelic women, or six angelic women offering these stones, gems and pearls from the colonies as kind of as having this real kind of superior role to play in this industry. one way, and I'll show you, this is kind of an interesting, there's a whole part in the book also about black labor, right? How black labor is also part of this story, and exploited black labor. We can maybe talk about this in the Q&A, but we do see that this is the first time really that on the diamond fields that we begin to see the exclusion of black labor from the industry. And that sets the tone for what happens later on the gold mines in the 1880s and 1890s, certain diamond laws, and then laws that are replicated on the diamond and on the gold fields that begin to really do form the foundation of apartheid that first is executed on the diamond fields. But that's a story that we don't really have a whole lot of time for today. But you can see some of this here in colonial exhibitions in 1886, but we also see them in New York City, we see them in Chicago, and elsewhere, where they staged entire mining displays, showing the public, you can see them behind glass here, showing the public how diamonds were mined, how they were washed, cut, and polished, and how they ended up in the jewelry cases and on people's décolleté ultimately, or fingers. And so there's also this story that's put on display for consumers to see where diamonds come from and who produces them, and how they become so sparkly. Here's the one in Chicago. The De Beers put up an entire mining display, and they shipped tens of thousands of pounds of soil from the South African diamond fields in bags across the Atlantic to Chicago. So they had quote unquote real soil to work with, and it was, according to the newspaper, the most carefully watched pile of dirt in the entire exhibition. Okay, let's move on to Amsterdam, and let me quickly check upon the time. So the majority of stones leave Great Britain, mostly inside of briefcases and luggage of buyers, for what contemporaries called hospitable Little Holland. In Amsterdam, stones were cut, polished, and prepared for the retail market. While diamond manufacturing was not a new industry in the Dutch capital, it expanded exponentially after the discovery of South African mines. The boom in supply made diamond factories familiar components of the urban landscape. In 1896, Amsterdam counted 7,500 mills, up tenfold from the early 1850s, and the diamond industry had become the third largest labor sector after construction and dock work. And as I mentioned in the beginning of my talk, over 50% of the Amsterdam Jewish population made its living from the stone as cutters, polishers, setters, apprentices, factory owners, supervisors, diamantaires, you name it. But contrary to their brethren across the English Channel, the majority of Jews in the diamond business were working class people who lived very modest lives. Amsterdam is in this regard fundamentally different from what we see in London or Berlin or Paris, where the large majority of Dutch Jews still live in working class conditions and are overwhelmingly poor. And so this accelerates in the around the turn of the century, really into the 1900s. But they're a few decades behind is what that happens elsewhere. I think it was Heinrich Heine who once said that if the world ever comes to an end, he wants to be in the Netherlands because everything happens 50 years later. And that was also certainly the case with Jews becoming middle and upper middle class. Amsterdam Jews proved indispensable to the success of the commodity chain. The millions of carats mined on the South African diamond fields could only find their way to affluent necklines after master cutters and polishers transformed rough stones into sparkly gems. While Europe counted various smaller centers of diamond manufacturing, Geneva and Antwerp rose later, Amsterdam in the 19th century was the principal home of this art. And you can see some of these still today, a lot of really quite massive buildings, no longer really in operation, but purpose-built diamond factories pop onto the scene in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. And it's the very first Amsterdam Diamond Exchange in the world is founded in Amsterdam. And you can see this here too, this building. And here's some pictures of the kind of working class laborers who are part of the scene. We also see the professionalization not merely of what's the mining that's happening in Africa, deep level mining with new machineries and water pumps, and the deeper they went, the more sophisticated machinery they needed. But we also see the professionalization in terms of what's happening in Amsterdam with steam-powered machines. This used to be a home craft. This was done at home. Sometimes horses or women would push the mills, in circles. They would make the mill spin. That's taken over by steam power, and then we see a professionalization by purpose-built factories that become operational. In Holland, the story is extremely political in a sense that we see the foundation of the very first, very first organized and state accepted, is that the word? Kind of a legally accepted labor union run by a man named Polak, who started out as a polisher and climbed up to become an enormously successful and influential labor leader. Unregulated labor conditions and the unpredictability of supply of stones, dependent on the dictates of the De Beers and the London Syndicate, politicized this proletariat, leading to massive strikes, and in 1894 to the country's first organized diamond workers' labor union, also known as the ANDB. And you can see this artwork on the right side of the empowerment of Jewish labor. Very successful. You can see here the people on strike. Very successful in a sense that Polak managed to introduce the very first 8-hour workday and a minimum wage. And here is Henry Polak. Is kind of the powerhouse behind this movement, and it really does become, and the book talks about this, it really does become the forerunner of the Dutch Labour Party. And so the Diamond Union had a very long-term effect on the Dutch political landscape, in that it set the tone for unionization and for the beginning of the Labour Party. Okay, New York. Final leg. By the time diamonds reach New York, they had traveled thousands of miles, had been touched and cut and polished and studied and appraised and passed on by numerous hands, finally ending their journey around the necks and fingers of the well-to-do. By the late 19th century, America, with its growing appetite for luxury commodities, had become the largest consumer of ornamental diamonds. And this is where print culture particularly comes in. We can see that diamonds are advertised now in magazines, and they take up entire pages. They're published in color. They're introducing diamonds on credit, which means that now the middle classes and the emerging middle classes could buy diamonds in installments rather than having to shell over a big pile of money for a diamond. Now you could get a catalog, and you could browse through that catalog to see what you want, and you could make a deposit, and then you could pay in the months to come to pay off your stone, which all of a sudden meant that you could afford it. Well, maybe not, but at least you thought you could afford it. And you could buy diamonds now that previously were really the prerogative of the very wealthy. And now this kind of desire is sanctioned and permitted and made possible by advertisement to large numbers of consumers. We can see that they're also trying to create manufacturing in New York City, and they're trying to create factories there, bringing both the equipment as well as the personnel from Amsterdam to New York This was partly the result of changing taxes and taxation on cut stones, which tripled, and so people thought that they could start manufacturing them at the very in the very place where the demand was highest. So why not do it in New York City? So they brought a lot of Dutch lapidaries over to see if they could start a business there. And so we see the beginning of a diamond exchange in New York City, and advertisements like these where you see the Stern brothers, cutters and importers of diamonds, referring both to Amsterdam and New York City, and the direct relations to, again, very close familial and commercial relationships. This one I wanted to show you because I love this advertisement, particularly on the left here. You can see you can buy diamonds on credit, but this is the diamond is presented here almost as a deity, where it shines its bright light on the faces of its consumers, both men and women, who raise their hands almost as if they're receiving a blessing for their consumerism. And the woman on the top holding the diamond rings in her hands, very angelic woman who blesses them. And so there's nothing that would please her so much as a diamond. A diamond would be forever, and that becomes De Beers most successful advertisement campaign, although later, 1947, they launched their most successful campaign. But already in the early 1900s, we see these kinds of advertisements with the gentleman on the right whispering literally like credit out of his mouth as he moves the ring onto the finger of his hopefully to be fiance. And so there is a reason why modern marriages proposals come with a diamond ring. That is not something that just automatically or organically pops up. That's very much created, and that creation of a tradition is very much part of this story as well. When you create the demand and create the illusion that diamonds are rare. Sorry to say, ladies and gentlemen, that diamonds are not rare. They are actually mined on every single continent these days except Europe, and they are made rare in a sense that that's very much controlled about how many stones are in circulation. But we like the idea of it, that this is something very valuable and expensive and beautiful, which all of those things are. But we also have fallen victim, in other words, to a very successful advertisement. Last thing I'll say, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A, is that the link between diamonds and Jews, which becomes, of course, people notice the presence of Jews in the industry, and the involvement of Jews in all facets of the diamond industry also has profound cultural ramifications. Late 19th century literary representations, particularly in the English language press and political cartoons, in popular fiction, associate diamonds with Jews. Victorian fiction, travel journals, political cartoons appropriated long-held stereotypes about Jews' allegedly innate business acumen or untrustworthiness or thirst for power. And timing here again matters, is that in an era when racial anti-Semitism is gaining ground, and East European Jewish immigration to England spikes, to the United States and to South Africa as well, Jewish success in the international diamond trade stirred up nativist anxieties that found expression in the literary press. You can see some of this here. This one is particularly vicious, one from the Owl in South Africa. Anti-Semitism wasn't new, visual anti-Semitism wasn't new, but now we see that those stereotypes come with diamonds. And you can see this here also here on the right side, where the very stereotypical obese Jewish representation is now has a shining diamond on his chest. So while diamonds in the long run benefited and empowered Jews, whether it was economically or politically, their prominence in the industry also worked against them in certain ways that we can see here in these images. Okay, today the commodity chain has shifted and multiplied, really, including new centers of production and manufacturing. Israel has taken an important position in the global trade, as has Mumbai. Amsterdam has really become a shadow of its former self, as the vast majority of Jewish cutters and polishers were murdered during the Nazi years. Antwerp, in that sense, has really managed to survive in ways that Amsterdam has not. The remaining few diamond factories are now mostly tourist attractions. But Antwerp is still flourishing, and the city's Hasidic community is deeply involved in diamond manufacturing and trade. So the story of diamonds and Jews continues, but my story here today does not. So let me open it up to Q&A, and Jonathan, maybe you can start us off.
Well, it's so interesting to hear your presentation, Saskia, and really you've only touched on many of the ideas explored in the book, which people really should read if they're interested. I suppose what strikes me is you've got this rigorous control of the mining of stones, and you've also got a rigorous control of the supply of those raw stones, and then really anybody can get involved. You've got a myriad of different people involved in the cutting and then the subsequent sale, and looking at it, what was it, some kind of genius, or did it just sort of work out like that? Because it seems that the lack of control at that point in the chain didn't affect the value of the commodity at all.
Right. Well, it's important, and I think I try to make this point in the book, is that while there is a strong Jewish presence in the industry, by no means exclusively Jewish, and that there were also many failures along the way. Not everybody was successful in this story. And if we look at Amsterdam, we also see a lot of non-Jews being engaged in diamond manufacturing. And so while I highlight particularly the Jewish role here, and your point is well taken, and it's certainly true that we do see I was a little bit hesitant to use the word control because it has a kind of a negative connotation to it. But it is really, in this case, when you think about De Beers, when you think about this Diamond Syndicate, they did control, in a lot of ways, production and distribution. It's very much in Jewish hands. But it's also true that in Amsterdam, we talk about manufacturing, for instance, that there are many, many non-Jews who are engaged in it as well. And you see what they call Jodenfabrieken, or Jewish factories that operated on Sundays, and then we have Christenfabrieken, or Christian factories that operated on Shabbat, and that they and so there was a real segregation in that sense, mostly because it was practical, not necessarily because it was ideological in any way. And so we see that manufacturing is shared by Jews and non-Jews. But it is, if you look at the percentage, for instance, of what the diamond industry, how heavily it was concentrated within the Jewish community, then it becomes really a predominant kind of commercial activity. Whereas in the Christian community, diamonds were just, that there were lots of other industries that Christians were involved in. But your point is well taken. That when we moved to New York City, we see lots of jewelers who are of non-Jewish descent who become engaged in this, in advertisement and in retail. And so this is, I think, a story I told about Jews in the industry and the real important contributions that they made to the creation of this commodity chain. And also in a way to really appreciate what the contributions that they made to the making of the modern world, and that we should normalize these stories rather than talk about it in terms of, they had power, all the power and control was in Jewish hands. And it's like, well, in a certain way, yes, but many of their non-Jewish peers had control over other industries that were very similar to their story. And so to be able to normalize these conversations about how Jews created an economic kind of commodity chain, and how they were successful and in many ways non-successful as well. We see, for instance, that there are Jews in South Africa who are testifying against other Jews in court because they're accusing them of illegal diamond dealing. Or we have vicious fights between Dutch Jewish proletariat workers and their factory owners who are also Jewish. We see in New York City, we see many American Jews fighting they're fighting hard to keep Jewish immigrants from getting into the country as lapidaries, because they're afraid that what it will do to their image as these kind of non-English speaking proletariat Jews coming to America. They saw that as kind of as detrimental to the kind of positive image they've been trying to create. And so this is not, in other words, a story that is uncomplicated, or it's not a story that because you were Jewish you were automatically successful in the business. This was very much a story of struggle and great success, but also of people working long hours in mills, in dusty and loud factories, who never became wealthy. And so it is as I like to sometimes be a bit corny, but it is a multifaceted story, right? Is that it has many facets to it that are both positive and negative as well.
So just a reminder to our audience, if you do want to ask Saskia a question, put it into the Q&A in the few minutes we have left. We have a question from Irene Glauschutz. I hope I've pronounced that properly. Irene is interested in who trained the diamond cutters and polishers. Obviously a job which would have to involve a great deal of precision.
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's an important one, because this is partly why the trade tends to be concentrated in certain families, because they're passing on their expertise to their sons and daughters, by the way. Women are also trained. Women oftentimes worked with what they called rose stones, a really small rose stones that because they had smaller hands. And so they're passing these skills on to their children, and they start apprenticeships very early on, 13 years old, when they become apprentices in these in factories, teaching the next generation the skills of either a cutter or setter or polisher or cleaver. It's also interesting to know that within manufacturing, there's an entire like different categories, right? Is that a setter was somebody who made the least amount of money, and so the only job that they had was to change the setting of the stone into warm lead. So you had to kind of melt the lead, change the position of the stone, let it cool off, and then they could put another facet on it and polish another facet, and then cool it off again, melt it, change the setting of the stone, do it again. That's the only job they had. So that didn't produce a whole lot of income. But then you had cleavers. Cleavers were kind of considered the aristocrats in the building or in the profession. And the aristocrats were, because cleaving was something that you really needed years and years of training for in order to become really proficient at it. So the inside of a diamond is really like the inside of a tree trunk. It has these kind of certain lines that is not visible to the eye, but once you cut a stone, it will split according to those lines, like wood. And so in order to really know how to cleave a stone, you really needed to know the stone and analyze it and know how it works. If you made a mistake, you ruined it. And so cleaving is a real, that was a real, how should I put it? One of the most difficult parts of creating an ornamental stone. But then you had polishers and cutters and all kinds of different categories within the business. But to answer your question, I'm going off on a rant, but it's the short answer to your question, it's passed on from generation to generation to children, and so it becomes really a kind of a family affair.
Now we have a question from Suzanne Korn. I'm not sure if this is covered in your book, but Suzanne's interested in whether Jews became involved with conflict diamonds.
That happens later. Well, at least the topic of conflict diamond is really something that falls outside of the kind of scope of my book. My book ends really in World War II, but we see conflict diamonds really is a story that happens after that. I think what the question means, well, for my period, the one that I looked at, Jews become involved in the imperial project, which is also complicated, especially when we're talking about Black labor and Black exploitation and the beginning of apartheid. And Jews are engaged in that as well, particularly because when they move to South Africa, or as South African Jews, they are seen as white. And all of a sudden, they are no longer the European other. They become part of the white minority, but a minority in power. And the other, all of a sudden, is not them, it's the Africans. And so they, in a way, they fall into a kind of, or abide by racial codes that works in their advantage as white merchants. And so, as conflicts, Jews engaged in conflict diamond is really a story that happens after World War II.
Mm. It's interesting you said, you know, diamonds are not rare, and yet they are still perceived so. And one would imagine with a globalized supply, somebody would break the spell. So what's the pinch point? What stops?
Because we want it to be rare.
People want it to be rare.
Yes, that's what we want, because we want to be able to own an object that is prestigious and that has a certain magic to it, or a certain image, right? And so it is changing a bit, though, in the last, I will say, 10, 20 years, that there's now a broader acceptance of artificial diamonds that are like a tenth of the value that we would normally pay for, let's say, a 2-carat stone. If you want to propose to someone and have a diamond ring, that you cannot see the difference with the naked eye, whether it's an artificially produced diamond or if it's the real deal, then there's more, especially among young people, a greater acceptance to buy artificial stones. And you really can't see the difference. They create stones that, I mean, all what diamonds are is the inside of a pencil, right? It's carbon. And so the inside of a pencil under great heat and great pressure creates a diamond stone. Over the course of millions of years is pushed through volcanic pressure to the surface. But you can recreate that in a lab, and that's what they've been doing, and selling these diamonds, and greater environmental conscience, greater acceptance that we might not want a diamond for a marriage proposal, but something else. That's all of a sudden, that is also more, well, all of a sudden, that does seem to be more accepted these days. So what we now see is that there are more hypes about different color diamonds, right? There was a couple of years where the pink diamond, that was it. The pink diamond was rare. And that is actually true. We do see different color diamonds being more rare than others. And so, and I went to the Amsterdam Diamond Museum a few years ago, and they took me to the back to kind of show, they knew I was working on this book, so they showed me all these different stones. And when you see them together, like spread out, you really do see the different shades, like a yellow diamond or a pink one. You see, they're really quite beautiful. And then at the end, they asked me how many I wanted to buy, and I said none. I was like, oh no, like, I'm just a historian. I don't make nearly enough money for that. And so they are really quite stunning. But yeah, we like the aura around the stone. That yeah, they are not. I'm you know, I sometimes say them in talks at the beginning. People don't like to hear it, but yeah, your diamonds aren't rare at all. You just pay a lot of money for them.
So this is book number 2. What's next? Have you got something in the pipeline?
Yeah, I'm taking the story of diamonds into the Nazi years. And so we see during the Nazi occupation that there's a real attempt to bring Nazi or diamond manufacturing under Nazi control. And there is an interesting story to be told. I stumbled upon, it really blew me away. I stumbled upon an architectural drawing in the archives of diamond factories inside of concentration camps. So inside the Dutch camp Vught, which is in the southern part of the country, and in Bergen-Belsen, they were trying to create diamond manufacturing by so-called diamond Jews. And so there's this real tension on the one hand to continue manufacturing during a time of war, because the Nazis want to exploit as much as they possibly can and take the resources to pay for the war. And diamonds in that sense fall in the category of gold and art and real estate and gemstones. And so it's part of looting, but also of exploiting a population till the very last minute to continue to produce stones. And that's the one part of the tension, is that we need Jews to cut and polish stones for us, even inside of barbed wire. And then the tension is between the second aim is the annihilation of that population. And so how does that work? And so this architectural drawing really kind of showed us how this tension came together in the camp, where they are wanting Jews to continue diamond polishing and cutting, but they're also murdering them at the same time. And so it's a really kind of it's a difficult story to tell for many reasons, but the attempt by the Nazis to claim the diamond industry and to continue the commodity chain during the war, that's the next project.
Well, do let us know when it's ready. We'd love to have you back so you could tell us all about it.
A few years.
This book is available now. You can get it from good booksellers or Amazon, and it's a really interesting read. And to thank you for being our guest, we're going to send you some of my photos, which hopefully you will enjoy flicking through once they've made it across the Atlantic. Now, just a few words about what's coming up. Next Monday's event with Roy Homburg has been postponed. Sadly, there's been a family bereavement, but we will keep you up to date with when that's happening. And also the Esther Simpson event, which was supposed to be happening this week, has also been postponed due to illness. So we haven't got any book events to tell you about, although there are quite a lot in the pipeline and some quite exciting things. But we are holding an event on the 25th of March in Leeds. And this is to celebrate another project that MILIM is running, that of documenting local oral histories. Please do visit our website for details of that. Much more is coming up. You'll find details of our events and how to book for them on our website at milim.org.uk. There are also, as I said earlier, recordings of past events there too. All online events are free, but we would encourage you to make a donation to support our work. There's a link on our website and also in the chat. Now, it remains for me to thank our guest, Saskia Coenen-Snyder, once again. Thank you so much, Saskia. It's been fascinating.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate your invitation.
And looking forward to seeing you all again soon. Until then, stay safe.
Good night, everyone.